It was a rainy afternoon when the doors of one of the most luxurious hotels in the city swung open, and a man in his late 30s stepped inside. Dressed in a simple black hoodie and worn-out jeans, he walked confidently to the front desk, his eyes scanning the lobby, seemingly unaware of the judgmental stares from the other guests. The receptionist, a young woman in her mid-20s, didn't even look up from her computer. With her fingers still tapping away at the keyboard, she spoke in a bored tone. "We don't allow entry without proper attire, sir. You'll need to leave." The man paused for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly, as if considering her words. He didn't respond immediately, but his face revealed no anger, just an eerie calmness that made the receptionist uneasy. He glanced at the large chandelier above him, the high-end furniture around him, and the lavish decor. For a brief moment, it almost seemed as though he wasn't fazed by her rejection. But the woman, clearly not recognizing him, assumed he was just another wanderer looking to sneak into the hotel. "We don't allow guests in casual clothing," she added, with a tone of finality. "If you don't mind, please step aside. We have a dress code here." The man stood there for another moment, taking in the words. His posture didn't change. He remained silent, and the air grew thick with tension. Finally, he turned and began to walk towards the exit. The receptionist, satisfied that the issue had been resolved, went back to typing. But as soon as he reached the door, the man paused once more. This time he turned his head slightly, just enough for her to catch the faintest hint of a smile. "Maybe you'll be surprised at what's about to happen," he said quietly. Then, without another word, he exited the hotel, leaving the receptionist in complete silence. Little did she know, the man who had just been turned away was the very reason this hotel existed. He wasn't a random guest. He wasn't just another man in casual clothes. He was the CEO, the owner, the one who had built this empire from the ground up. And he had just been humiliated by the very staff he had paid to work for him. What the receptionist didn't know, what none of the employees or guests knew, was that this wasn't just a typical day. This was the beginning of something that would change everything for everyone involved. He didn't head home, as the receptionist assumed. He didn't take the nearest cab, retreating into anonymity. Instead, he made a call. The kind of call that would change the course of the day. His voice, calm and controlled, carried an authority that anyone who knew him would instantly recognize. "Prepare for the grand opening. We're going to make an impression today." A long pause followed, as the person on the other end of the line processed his words. There was no confusion. They knew exactly what he meant. "Understood," came the voice, and the call ended. The man, still in his hoodie and jeans, looked around the street for a moment, his mind clear, his resolve firm. As he walked away from the hotel, a few steps were all it took for him to blend into the busy city. He wasn't just walking for the sake of it. There was a mission in every stride. The very hotel that had turned him away would soon know the full extent of its mistake. Back inside the hotel, the receptionist was still at the front desk, unaware that she had just made one of the biggest errors of her career. Her co-workers, who had been quietly watching the exchange, snickered behind her back. They didn't think much of it. After all, she was just doing her job, right? But that was before the owner of the hotel returned. Minutes passed, and the sound of the front door opening once again caught the receptionist's attention. She didn't look up right away. It was probably another guest. But then she heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps that felt different. Commanding, not hurried or casual. She glanced up, and for the briefest moment, Her heart stopped. Standing there in the doorway was the same man who she had so quickly dismissed. But this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him, a procession of high-level staff entered the hotel, all carrying folders and tablets, moving with military precision. Their suits and formal attire contrasted sharply with his casual hoodie, but they were all paying their full attention to him. "Excuse me," the receptionist said, her voice tinged with uncertainty. "Can I help you with something?" The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he calmly walked to the front desk, his presence filling the room. His gaze shifted toward the young woman who had turned him away just moments ago. She shifted in her seat, nervously, trying to smile as if nothing had happened. "Actually, you can," he said, his tone still calm but now carrying an undercurrent of authority. "You can help me by bringing me the manager. Immediately." She blinked, caught off guard by the request. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. He was still dressed casually, still in his hoodie and jeans, yet the air around him had shifted completely. The receptionist's fingers hovered over the keyboard for a moment before she quickly pressed a button on her desk phone. Within moments, the manager, a tall and imposing figure, appeared at the desk. His expression was one of confusion, but there was also a slight arrogance, the kind that comes from believing you're in control. He hadn't seen the man enter and had no idea who he was. All he saw was a guest who didn't belong in a luxury hotel like this. "Yes? Can I help you?" the manager asked, his tone dismissive. Though he was trying to remain professional, the man smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. "You'll be the one helping me, actually. The question is, how will you do that?" The receptionist glanced nervously between the two men, unsure of how to proceed. She had no idea what was happening, but she could feel that something monumental was about to unfold. "I've had enough of being dismissed," the man continued, his voice suddenly louder, cutting through the tension. "I own this place. I built it. And I've just been humiliated by the very people who are supposed to represent my brand. So here's the deal. You'll need to fix this, and you'll need to do it quickly." The manager blinked in disbelief. The idea that this man could be the owner was absurd. He had been in charge of the hotel for years and knew the owner to be a high-profile, well-dressed businessman. This man in front of him clearly didn't fit that mold. He was just a guy in a hoodie. "Look, if you're trying to get attention," the manager started, but he was quickly interrupted. "I'm not here for attention. I'm here to remind you of who I am and what this hotel represents. You'll fix this mistake now," the man insisted. The manager's eyes flickered to the receptionist, then back at the man, trying to decide whether this was some sort of prank or if he was genuinely being confronted by the hotel's owner. But before he could respond, the doors to the hotel swung open again, and the hotel's PR team, alongside several security guards, walked in. "Get ready for the opening," the man said, barely acknowledging the people now surrounding him. He turned back to the manager. "And as for you, your career here ends today." The manager's face went white as the reality of the situation set in. He had no idea who this man really was, but the pieces were starting to fall into place. The receptionist, still standing frozen behind the desk, watched in stunned silence. What had she just done? The manager stood there, his mouth slightly open, words failing him as he tried to process the gravity of the situation. He had just been confronted by someone who not only had the power to end his career, but was clearly not someone to be underestimated. The PR team, seeing the tension in the air, immediately began to move into action. They knew better than anyone that when the boss was unhappy, things could get out of hand very quickly. "Sir, we'll make sure everything is sorted out," one of the PR members said, stepping forward and offering a reassuring smile. "We'll get your room ready right away." The man glanced at them, his expression unreadable. "Room? I don't need a room. I need you to fix the problem here. Now." The PR team froze for a moment, unsure of what he meant. It wasn't until the receptionist, still standing frozen behind the desk, slowly pieced together the realization that they were dealing with the hotel's actual owner. The man, whose image was plastered on billboards across the city, whose name was recognized globally, was standing in front of them, in a hoodie and jeans, no less. She began to feel a cold sweat forming on her palms. Her face turned pale, and the color drained from her skin as she met his gaze. I didn't mean to. I didn't know it was you," she stammered, but her words sounded empty even to herself. She could barely meet his eyes, the weight of her mistake crushing her. He turned his attention back to the manager, his voice calm but unyielding. "You've made a big mistake. You've humiliated me, and worse, you've shown disrespect to the very people I built this business for." He paused, letting his words sink in. "This hotel was never meant to be a place where people like you get to play gatekeeper. It was meant to be a place where everyone feels welcome, regardless of what they're wearing, who they are, or where they come from. But today, you've shown me that you don't understand that." The manager shifted uneasily. He didn't know how to respond to a person who had built the empire he worked for, especially when that person was so visibly disappointed. He had assumed the man was just another unruly guest trying to bypass the hotel's policies, but now it was clear how wrong he was. The receptionist, her voice shaking, spoke up, still in disbelief. "Sir, we can fix this. I'll make sure this doesn't happen again. Please, don't fire anyone. It was my mistake. I was just following protocol. I didn't know you were—" Her voice trailed off, but the man raised his hand, signaling for her to stop. "It's not just about your mistake. It's about how everyone here treats the people who walk through these doors. You've forgotten the reason why this hotel exists. And for that, I'm afraid there's no going back." The room fell into an uncomfortable silence, and for a brief moment, the only sound was the distant hum of the city outside. The manager and the receptionist exchanged glances, both of them beginning to understand the weight of their error. Then, the man turned to one of the PR team members, his eyes steely with determination. "Get me the list of the top performers in this hotel. I want to know who's worth keeping and who's not. Make sure no one here gets to stay if they don't understand what this brand stands for." "Yes, sir, right away," the PR member replied, nodding quickly before hurrying to get the list. The man's eyes flicked to the receptionist one last time. "And as for you," he said slowly, his voice quieter but still firm, "I'll give you a chance to redeem yourself, but let this be a lesson. When you work for someone, respect is paramount. You didn't respect me, and that mistake will haunt you for a long time." The receptionist nodded, her face flushed with embarrassment, though she couldn't find the words to reply. She had never imagined a simple mistake could cost her so much. Before anyone could say anything else, the man turned on his heel and started walking toward the elevator. The PR team and security quickly followed, their heads down in quiet reverence. No one dared to speak as the elevator doors closed, taking the CIO and his entourage up to the private floors. The receptionist stood still, her body frozen in place. The manager, now visibly sweating, finally turned toward her, his face pale and shaking. You should have known who he was." I didn't know," she whispered, still in shock. "How could I have known?" But it wasn't just a lack of knowledge. It was the arrogance, the presumption that someone, anyone, could walk in and be dismissed simply because of what they were wearing. It was a lesson about judging people, about assuming, about how the smallest act of disrespect could shatter everything. The rest of the day was a blur. The atmosphere in the hotel had shifted from one of luxury to one of tension. Staff members were being called into meetings, their fates hanging in the balance. The CEO was not just a figurehead. He was a man of action, someone who would not tolerate incompetence or disrespect, no matter how small. Hours passed, and the receptionist could only wonder what would happen next. Would she be fired? Would her future in the hotel industry be over? She had no answers, but she knew one thing for certain. Nothing would ever be the same. The following morning was quiet. Too quiet. The usual bustle of the hotel, the flow of guests arriving, the constant hum of activity in the lobby, it all felt like it was happening on the other side of a glass wall. The receptionist stood behind her desk, trying to focus on the usual tasks, but her mind kept drifting back to the events of the previous day. She couldn't stop replaying the scene in her head. The CEO walking in, the realization dawning on her, the manager's failure to grasp the magnitude of the situation. The hotel felt different now. The sense of normalcy had been replaced with an undercurrent of unease. There was no denying it. The CEO had made a statement, one that would linger for a long time. And then, just as the morning was beginning to feel unbearably stagnant, the silence was broken by the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching the front desk. It was the manager. He walked in with his head down, not making eye contact with anyone. The usual air of arrogance that had once followed him was gone, replaced by something else, something darker. He didn't stop at his office. Instead, he headed straight toward the receptionist, the weight of his actions apparent in the way he moved. "Hey," he said softly, his voice lacking its usual confident edge. "We need to talk." She glanced up, unsure of what to expect. She had seen him in meetings before, seen him make decisions that affected people's careers, but this was different. His posture was slumped. His usual authoritative tone was replaced by one of uncertainty. "Sure," she replied cautiously, not sure whether she was about to be reprimanded or given a second chance. He leaned against the desk, his hands clasped in front of him. "I've been called into a meeting this morning with the PR team. They're not happy. They're looking for answers." The receptionist didn't say anything at first, just waiting for him to continue. Her heart was racing. She didn't know what he was going to say next, but she had a sinking feeling that it wasn't going to be good. "The CEO is putting a lot of pressure on everyone. He's not going to let anyone slide, especially not after yesterday," he continued, his gaze flickering to the side. "And you're going to be part of that conversation." Her chest tightened. She had hoped, at best, that she would be able to avoid getting caught up in the fallout of the previous day's events. But now it seemed inevitable. The weight of her mistake was catching up with her, and it was about to get a lot worse. She began, but the manager interrupted her. "I know you didn't do it on purpose," he said, his voice softer now. "But the fact is, you failed to do your job. You didn't recognize him. You didn't even ask for his name." The words stung. She knew they were true, but hearing them come from him, her superior, made it harder to swallow. She had let herself be blinded by protocol, by the rules, by the belief that no one could possibly be above those rules. She had failed to see that the one person who could rewrite the entire story of the hotel was standing right in front of her, and she had turned him away. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "I should have known. I should have done better." The manager's eyes softened for a moment. He let out a long sigh. "You're not the only one who's going to be dealing with the fallout from yesterday. But we have to make sure we don't repeat this mistake. We have to show him we've learned from it." The receptionist nodded, feeling a deep pit form in her stomach. It wasn't just about her mistake anymore. It was about what came next. What could possibly be done to undo the damage? Hours later, the CEO arrived back at the hotel, his presence still commanding the attention of everyone around him. He had left in the early morning, taking meetings, but now he was back with a clear purpose. The PR team, the managers, and even security were all on high alert, aware that his return would mark the next phase in the hotel's future. The receptionist, still feeling the weight of yesterday's events, could barely bring herself to look up as he walked through the door. She kept her head down, but her eyes flickered toward him as he passed, his stride purposeful and unyielding. The PR team followed closely behind, their expressions a mix of determination and anxiety. The CEO was already in the midst of a restructuring process, and now it was time to put the changes into motion. He walked to the front desk, where the receptionist was standing, her heart pounding in her chest. There was no denying it now. This was the moment of reckoning. Without a word, he approached her, his gaze intense. "I'm not here to punish anyone," he began, his voice low but firm. "But I am here to remind everyone why this hotel exists and what we stand for. If you want to work here, you need to understand what it means to represent this brand. We don't turn people away. We don't judge by appearances. We treat every single guest with the respect they deserve." The receptionist nodded quickly, her throat tight. The words he was saying weren't new. They were the very values that the hotel had once prided itself on, but she had failed to uphold them. Now she was being given one final chance to prove herself. "I'm going to give you a second chance," the CEO continued. "But make no mistake, your actions have consequences. You've learned from this, right?" She swallowed hard and met his eyes. "Yes, sir. I've learned. I'll never make this mistake again." "Good," he said, his tone still commanding, but there was a slight shift, just a hint of something softer in his eyes. "Because if this happens again, there will be no second chances. Not for anyone." With that, he turned and walked away, his entourage trailing behind him. The receptionist stood there, rooted to the spot, feeling the weight of his words. She didn't know what would happen next. She didn't know if she would ever truly be able to redeem herself in his eyes. But one thing was certain. She would never forget the lesson she had learned. Not just about protocol, but about humanity. About how easily it was to judge someone based on what they wore or how they looked. And in that moment, she knew she would do everything she could to live up to the standards the CEO had set. The days that followed felt like a blur to the receptionist. She went through the motions, handling guests with an even greater sense of care, trying to put the events of the past week behind her. But the reality was, everything had changed. It wasn't just about a mistake anymore. It was about what it meant to work at this hotel and what it truly stood for. And it wasn't just her who had to change. The entire hotel staff had felt the ripple effect of what had happened. The manager, who had once walked with unshakable confidence, was now under pressure to make sure this incident didn't tarnish the hotel's reputation further. He had become more involved in the day-to-day operations, watching every detail like a hawk, determined to avoid another slip-up. It was clear that the CEO's words had carried weight, not just for the receptionist, but for everyone in the building. And then, one day, it all came to a head. It was late afternoon, and the lobby was bustling with activity. The usual hum of conversation filled the air, the low murmur of guests checking in, the polite exchange between hotel staff and visitors. The receptionist, her hands steady as she typed away on the computer, felt a sudden presence at her side. She turned to find the manager standing there, his face a mixture of frustration and something deeper, something she couldn't quite place. "Hey," he said quietly, his tone unusually tense. "We need to talk." Her stomach dropped. The last time he had said those words, it hadn't ended well. "What's going on?" she asked, trying to keep her voice calm, though the anxiety was clear in her eyes. The manager glanced around, ensuring no one was close enough to overhear. "I just got a call from the CEO's office. He wants to meet with me. Well, with all of us, in the conference room. I don't know what it's about, but I have a feeling it's not going to be a simple discussion." The receptionist felt her heart race again. She had a sinking feeling she knew exactly what it was about. The CEO had given her a second chance. But what about everyone else? What about the others who had been part of this chain of events? "I'll be right there," she said, trying to steady her breath. When they arrived at the conference room, the entire hotel leadership team was gathered. The CEO stood at the head of the table, his expression serious. The atmosphere in the room was thick with tension, and everyone could sense that this meeting was not going to be about mundane hotel operations. The CEO's presence alone made it clear. This was going to be a moment of reckoning for the entire team. The manager took his seat, and the receptionist hesitated for a moment before sitting down as well. She could feel her palms growing clammy. She had no idea how this meeting would unfold, but she knew it wasn't going to be easy. The CEO began speaking almost immediately, his voice steady, yet commanding. "I don't need to remind any of you of the importance of our hotel's reputation. Our brand has always prided itself on being more than just a place to stay. We are a symbol of luxury, of inclusivity, and above all, respect." He paused, making sure everyone was paying attention. The receptionist could feel the weight of his gaze sweeping over the table, resting on each person for just a moment longer than usual. "We've made mistakes. Some of you have made mistakes. But there's one thing I know. We don't fix problems by pretending they didn't happen. We address them, we learn from them, and we make sure they don't happen again." The room was quiet, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Everyone was waiting for him to say more, to give them some indication of what was coming next. The receptionist, her mind racing, wondered if she would be the next one to be singled out. "The mistake that was made at this hotel," the CEO continued, "was a failure not just by one person, but by all of us. It's a failure to see past appearances, a failure to treat every guest with the respect they deserve, regardless of who they are or what they look like." The words stung, but they also felt like a necessary reminder. This wasn't just about one mistake. It was about an entire mindset that had allowed something like this to happen in the first place. He shifted his stance, looking around at the staff seated at the table. This hotel has always prided itself on treating people with dignity. But somewhere along the way, we got comfortable. We got complacent. We thought that as long as we followed the rules, everything would be fine. The receptionist felt a sharp pang of guilt. She knew exactly what he was talking about. She had fallen victim to that same mindset, the belief that protocols and appearances mattered more than treating people as human beings, not just customers. She had let herself get caught up in the idea that some guests were more important than others, when in reality, every guest had a story, a reason for being there. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," the CEO continued, "about how we move forward, how we fix this." He paused again, his eyes scanning the room. "We're going to start by addressing the elephant in the room. There will be new training for all employees, and it won't be just about customer service. It will be about understanding, about empathy, and about making sure that no one ever feels less than because of the way they look or how much money they have." The receptionist's heart raced. This was more than just a punishment or a reprimand. It was a complete overhaul of the way the hotel would operate going forward. It would require every single person to not only be better at their job, but to be better people. The CEO's gaze lingered on her for a moment, and she held her breath. She wasn't sure if she was about to be reprimanded again, or if the weight of this conversation had already been lifted from her shoulders. But instead of calling her out, the CEO turned his attention back to the entire room. "This starts today. We're not wasting any more time. This hotel has always stood for something bigger than just luxury. It stands for respect. And that's the only thing we'll tolerate moving forward." The following weeks were some of the most challenging yet transformative days the hotel had ever experienced. The CEO's speech had shaken the team to its core, but it also ignited a fire in them. Everyone, from the housekeeping staff to the managers, had to take a hard look at themselves and their actions. They had to not only acknowledge the mistakes, but also take ownership of them and commit to change. The training sessions, which had been outlined by the CEO, were intense and thorough. They weren't just about memorizing guest names or how to greet clients with a smile. They focused on deeper, more meaningful issues. The employees learned about biases, how their backgrounds and experiences shaped their perceptions, and why it was essential to break down stereotypes, not just in the workplace, but in their lives. They learned about empathy, not just as a concept, but as a skill that could be practiced, honed, and applied. For the receptionist, it felt like a personal awakening. She'd spent years in customer service, doing her job to the best of her ability, but she had never truly thought about what her actions meant beyond just delivering a service. It had always been about making sure things ran smoothly, that there were no complaints, and that guests left satisfied. But now she realized that it wasn't enough to simply go through the motions. She had to understand the people she was serving, truly see them for who they were, not just the role they played. One day, in the middle of a session, she found herself reflecting on the CEO's words, the idea that appearances could be deceiving. It made her think back to that fateful day when she had mistaken the CEO for just another guest. In that moment, she realized something crucial. She had let her assumptions cloud her judgment. She had focused too much on what someone looked like on the surface, and in doing so, she had missed the truth. It wasn't just the CEO who had been affected by that mistake. It was the entire team. They were all part of the same story, each of them contributing to the larger narrative. It became clear that the CEO had never wanted to make an example of anyone. He had wanted to make sure they all understood the gravity of the situation, because it wasn't just about fixing one incident. It was about preventing future ones and ensuring that every person who walked into the hotel felt valued, respected, and seen for who they truly were. As the weeks went by, the atmosphere in the hotel began to shift. The staff no longer treated each guest the same way they had before. Now, they saw them for who they truly were, beyond the surface level. There was a newfound sense of empathy in every interaction. Guests noticed the difference too. They began to leave positive reviews, speaking not just about the luxury of the hotel, but about the warmth and authenticity of the staff. For the receptionist, the change was most evident in her daily interactions. She found herself connecting with guests in ways she never had before. She no longer saw them as transactions or numbers on a guest list. She saw them as people with stories, hopes, and dreams. And in turn, they began to see her as more than just a receptionist. They saw her as someone who genuinely cared about their experience. Someone who was invested in making sure their stay was memorable for all the right reasons. But there was still a lingering question that the receptionist couldn't shake off. What had happened to the CEO? After all, he had been the one who had faced the brunt of the incident, the one who had been wronged in the most public way. Had he truly forgiven them all for what had happened? Had he moved on from the mistake? Or was there still some unresolved tension? As the weeks went on, the receptionist found herself waiting for the moment when the CEO would return. She hadn't seen him since that day in the conference room, and she wasn't sure what kind of leader he would be now. Would he go back to his role with the same authority and distance as before? Or had this incident fundamentally changed him as well? Finally, the day arrived when she got her answer. It was a quiet morning, and the hotel was running smoothly, almost too smoothly, in fact. There were no issues, no complaints, no incidents. The receptionist was sitting at her desk, working through the check-in process for a group of guests, when she heard the familiar sound of footsteps approaching. She looked up, expecting to see another guest arriving, but instead, she saw the CEO walking toward her. He was dressed casually today, not in the usual tailored suit, but in something more relaxed. A reminder that, despite his title, he was still a person who had been through something remarkable. As he approached, the receptionist stood up instinctively. There was an awkward silence at first, and she wasn't sure what to say. After all, this was the man who had been the subject of such a public mistake. The man who had changed everything for her and the entire hotel. He smiled gently, almost as if he knew what she was thinking. "How are things going?" he asked. His voice was calm, but there was something in his tone that made her realize just how much he had grown from this experience as well. "They're going well," she replied, her voice steady. "We've all been working hard to make sure things stay on track. I think we're all doing better." The CEO nodded. "I'm glad to hear that. I want you to know that I don't hold any grudges. What happened wasn't just about the mistake. It was about what we learned from it. And what you all did after that showed me that you're not just employees. You're part of something bigger." The receptionist was taken aback by his words. She had expected him to be distant, to maintain his role as the authoritative figure. But he wasn't. He was someone who had walked through the same lessons, someone who understood the value of learning from mistakes. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "It means a lot to hear that." The CEO smiled again, a little wider this time. "Keep doing what you're doing. The hotel's success isn't just about the luxury. It's about the people who come here and feel welcome. It's about making sure everyone, no matter who they are, feels valued." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving the receptionist standing there, a sense of relief washing over her. The weight of the incident had lifted. There was no more tension, No more fear of being judged or reprimanded. The CEO had shown them all what true leadership was about, not just in business, but in life. And as the receptionist sat back down at her desk, she realized something important. The hotel had become more than just a place to stay. It had become a reflection of the people inside it. It was no longer just about luxury. It was about respect, inclusivity, and making sure every person who walked through the doors was seen for who they really were. As the days turned into weeks, the hotel's transformation continued to unfold. Not just in its operations, but in its very culture. The training sessions had planted the seeds of change, and now everyone seemed to be nurturing them with purpose. The staff, from the kitchen team to the front desk, began to embody the principles of empathy, respect, and inclusivity in their interactions, with a growing awareness of how their actions could impact guests in ways they had never considered before. But there were still challenges to face. Old habits didn't die overnight, and not every employee was on board with the changes. There were murmurs in the hallways and occasional side conversations, where people expressed doubts about whether the training would make a real difference, or if it was just another corporate mandate that would eventually fade away. Some questioned whether the CEO's vision of respect and understanding could ever truly take hold, especially in an industry where first impressions were often based solely on appearances and social status. The receptionist, who had undergone the most personal transformation, had become something of an ambassador for the new culture within the hotel. She found herself speaking to colleagues, gently reminding them of the lessons they had learned, encouraging them to look beyond the surface when interacting with guests. But she knew there was still work to be done. She had seen the power of a single mistake, the damage it could cause to the reputation of the hotel and the relationships between its staff and guests. But she had also seen the potential for growth. She had witnessed firsthand how an open mind and a willingness to change could make all the difference. One afternoon, as the receptionist was helping a group of guests check in, she noticed a familiar face among them. It was the businessman who had been at the hotel during that fateful day, one of the guests who had witnessed the CEO's encounter with the receptionist. He was a regular guest, someone who had stayed at the hotel multiple times. But this time, he wasn't alone. He had brought his family along. Seeing him again reminded the receptionist of everything that had happened. That day had been a turning point for her and for the hotel. She had made a mistake, but it had also set the stage for the changes that were now taking root. She hadn't seen the businessman in weeks, and she wondered if he had noticed the difference in the hotel since the CEO's speech. She wondered if he had observed the subtle shift in the way the staff treated guests, if he had felt the change in the air. As the businessman approached the check-in desk, their eyes met. He smiled warmly, and she returned the gesture. There was a quiet understanding between them, a shared recognition of how far the hotel had come. "Good afternoon," the receptionist said, her voice steady and polite. "It's great to see you again. I trust your previous stay with us was to your satisfaction." The businessman smiled. "It was," he replied. "But I've heard a lot of positive things about the hotel recently. I had to see for myself." The receptionist's curiosity was piqued. "Positive things? What kind of things?" "Well," the businessman began, his tone becoming more reflective, "I've been in this business a long time, and I can tell when a place has undergone a real change. You've got something different going on here, something more personal, more meaningful. It's not just about the luxury anymore. It feels like a place where people genuinely care." The receptionist felt a surge of pride. She hadn't expected him to notice, but his words confirmed what she had hoped for. The changes they had made were not just superficial. They were real, and they were making an impact. "I'm glad to hear that," she said, her voice filled with gratitude. "It's been a journey for all of us, but we've been working hard to make sure that every guest who walks through our doors feels respected and valued." The businessman nodded, his expression thoughtful. "It's clear. I've seen a lot of hotels, but this one stands out. And I can tell you're not just doing it for the sake of appearances. You're doing it because it's the right thing to do." The receptionist smiled, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. For weeks, she had wondered whether the changes would stick, whether the hotel would truly evolve into something better, or if it would fall back into old patterns. But hearing the businessman's words confirmed that they were on the right path. As the businessman checked in, he turned to her once more. "I'll be sure to tell my colleagues and friends about the changes here. You've earned it." It was a small gesture, but to the receptionist, it meant everything. She had feared that the hotel's reputation would always be tainted by that one mistake, but now she saw that the truth was far more powerful than any past error. The hotel was being defined not by a single incident, but by its ability to adapt, to grow, and to embrace change. The day's events were a reminder that change wasn't easy, nor was it immediate. It took time, patience, and consistent effort, but it also brought a deep sense of fulfillment. The receptionist realized that what they had created at the hotel wasn't just a place for people to stay. It had become a space for transformation, a place where people were not judged by their appearance, where mistakes were acknowledged and learned from, and where empathy was the guiding principle in every interaction. But even as the hotel's culture began to solidify, one question still lingered in the back of her mind. Had they truly learned enough? Had they done enough to make sure that this shift in mindset wasn't just temporary? As she continued her work day after day, she knew one thing for sure. They would never stop growing. The journey was ongoing, and with every step forward, they were proving that change wasn't just possible, it was essential. As the months passed, the hotel continued to thrive. It wasn't just a place to stay anymore. It was a symbol of growth, redemption, and the power of second chances. The CEO's vision had not only transformed the hotel's operations, but had ignited a cultural shift that went beyond just customer service. It became a beacon of respect, inclusivity, and genuine hospitality, and the effects rippled through every corner of the business. The staff, once skeptical, had fully embraced the changes. They no longer saw their work as just a job. It had become a mission. They didn't just serve guests. They made people feel seen, valued, and respected. And with every guest who walked through the doors, the hotel's reputation grew stronger. People weren't just talking about the luxury. They were talking about the experience. They were talking about how they felt when they stayed there, how the staff made them feel like family. The receptionist, who had once been at the center of the controversy, now stood proudly as an example of the hotel's commitment to growth. She had become a role model for her colleagues, a living testament to the power of self-reflection and change. She had made mistakes, but she had also learned from them, and in doing so, had helped shape a better environment for everyone. One evening, as she walked through the hotel lobby after her shift, she couldn't help but smile. The once tense atmosphere had given way to something entirely different, something warm and welcoming. The guests, whether they were regulars or newcomers, seemed more relaxed, more at ease. There was a sense of trust in the air, something that hadn't existed before. It was as if the hotel had finally come into its own, becoming more than just a luxury destination. It had become a place of genuine connection. The CEO, too, had witnessed the transformation. He visited the hotel regularly, always looking for ways to further improve. But he knew, deep down, that the heart of the hotel's success wasn't in its marble floors or grand chandeliers. It was in the people. It was in the staff who had chosen to embrace change, and the guests who had chosen to give them a second chance. Together, they had created something truly special. As the receptionist looked around at the smiling faces, she realized just how far they had come.